The shocking events of the last 24 hours clearly demonstrate that President Donald Trump intends to use his remaining time in office to undermine the peaceful and lawful transition of power to his elected successor, Joe Biden. We believe the risks of allowing the president to continue to use our service during this period are simply too great. Therefore, we are extending the block we have placed on his Facebook and Instagram accounts indefinitely and for at least the next 2 weeks until the peaceful transition of power is complete. So says Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg. A pretty stunning announcement when Facebook said yesterday that it will block the president for the duration of his term. Meanwhile, Twitter, which had blocked Mr. Trump's account on Wednesday for posts that violated, they said, its rules, lifted the suspension, and indeed the president has resumed tweeting. Anytime there's a story in the news that has to do with Facebook, I think of Stephen Levy. Stephen Levy is the editor-at-large at Wired. He truly wrote the definitive book on Facebook, its founding, and the way in which it runs its business. It's called Facebook, The Inside Story, and Stephen joins me now. Hey, Stephen, nice to see you. Nice to have you back on the program. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's always fantastic to be on your show, Michael. I love it.
Stephen, before I get into the very most recent events, I went back and I didn't reread the entire book, which I loved. It's more than 500 pages long, but I did go back and review all of my notes from our prior conversations. And one thing that I think we need to remind the audience is that Donald Trump relied heavily on Facebook to get elected. There was a perception that Hillary was much better organized in 2016, but when it came to Facebook, there was no comparison between the two candidates. He relied on and used very effectively this medium.
That's right. And what he mostly did was through the ad part of Facebook, pushing things to people's news feeds and then relying on people. Some people would then augment the advertisements by sharing them pretty widely. And then there were other forces on Facebook that helped him out, like people circulating disinformation that sent them to private pages with advertising. It turned out that disinformation that helped Trump and hurt Hillary was more profitable than the other way around. And then, of course, there were the Russians who were using Facebook to try to help Facebook. But I'm not sure how much of an impact that had. I think it was, if you wanted going to rate them, it was mostly the ads. They did as much as 75,000 different ads in a day on Facebook.
Wow.
And they really knew how to target those to the people who were most vulnerable to a given message.
And Facebook, because of the business relationship, not because of favoritism that they were showing to him, but he was a valued customer, so much so that they had Facebook folks embedded, one or two individuals in the campaign just to be able to manage the way in which the Trump campaign was advertising through their platform.
That's right. It was an offer made to both campaigns. The Clinton campaign said, nah, no thanks, we're good. And Brad Parscale, who was the architect of the Trump campaign, said, hey, bring it on. I'll take any help I need. And they made sure that the person that Facebook sent was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. He later, after the election, he turned coat and went to work for the other side. But at the time, he was Republican, and he helped share all of Facebook's secrets. And they weren't nefarious secrets. They were the same ones that Facebook used for big advertisers like Procter & Gamble, and they went to town with it.
Content moderation is tough. That's something else that I learned from your book. Here's a paragraph. It's Facebook's key dilemma. It keeps hiring moderators, but the volume of content they view is still so much that they have to move too fast to do the job right. People notice. When someone mistakenly has a picture removed, they go to social media to complain. When someone reports offensive content and it's not taken down, more complaints. The media notices. The journalistic equivalent of shooting fish in a barrel is following up on a report that Facebook blew a call that now looks terrible, but was probably the result of an overworked and perhaps traumatized moderator. Before I talk about content regulation for the president, which I guess is relatively easy because you can follow his Twitter feed, will you say a word about the approach that Facebook has taken to moderate the content of all the rest of us? For example, you tell an amazing story in your book about being provided access to a facility that then existed in Phoenix. And maybe you'll paint the picture of what you saw there.
Sure. What happens is they have about 15,000 people. Facebook doesn't pay them directly. They have a contractor to do that because they don't want to keep their head count too much. But that really says something about the way they see these people in their own food chain, that they're not hiring them full time. And, they sit there at these displays. They don't get their own desk. They don't put their little knickknacks by them. They sit at a space on a work table with a couple of displays. And every 40 seconds, they're shown a different piece of content that someone complained about, or maybe their algorithms flagged as potentially against the rules, and they have to make a decision. Sometimes if they take a little longer, that's okay, but they're responsible for getting rid of a certain amount of complaints a day, and it's an average of 40 seconds to say, okay, this violates the rules, this doesn't violate the rules. Some of the content is super disturbing, and some of the content is just complicated. It's tough to figure out what hate speech is sometimes, whether someone is making a remark satirically or whether it is an actual expression of hate. And so these things go through. A lot of people are unhappy if their content is taken down or content that offends them is left up. So you're never going to satisfy everyone, but it's an effort that has to be done if you want Facebook to be a place where people feel comfortable going. And that's what I wrote about today, and in terms of the larger issue of what Facebook wants itself to be. Where do you draw the line? And as it turns out, algorithmically, you can make improvements. And Facebook did this experiment after the election where they actually ranked higher the articles that came from, quote, reputable publications. And it made for what someone internally said a nicer news feed. And that actually worked. But then Facebook found that experiments like that made people come to Facebook a little less. Maybe they were drawn by the sensationalist stuff. And Facebook said, whoa, we can't have that. We got to have people come in there all the time. And they backed away. And I felt that was a bad decision. I thought, okay, if you take a short-term hit and maybe the nicer news feed doesn't get people hooked as much, you're going to figure out different ways to get people back. What drew people originally to Facebook was they got to know what their friends were up to. And maybe there's friendlier ways to draw people back. Right now, Facebook is hooked on a drug, the drug of sensationalism. And I think it's got to go cold turkey and move away from that. And I think that, from building from that baseline, it's not going to, people aren't going to abandon it. They can build itself into a better service that is better for society, and their own employees wouldn't feel, as I write, like they're working for Satan.
It's the ultimate window into man's soul, right? I mean, the question of whether we're intrinsically good or evil people, we could debate by looking through the Facebook lens. When you talk about your Phoenix experience, I have this image of you walking through cubicles where on a screen at one time there's a swastika, and then there's a penis, and then there's violence, and like some poor son of a gun is sitting there in real time trying to decide whether to leave it up or take it down.
Right. Yeah. Well, actually, they wouldn't let me look at the actual content because of privacy. But I did talk to a number of these moderators. And one thing I asked them, because Facebook's eventual solution for this, they say, is, well, we're going to have artificial intelligence figure this out. As we get better and better and better to algorithmically identify where a piece of content, might break our rules, we wouldn't need so much these moderators. We wouldn't have this human error. So I asked these moderators, well, do you think that's possible? You do this all the time. And they just laugh. They said that's ridiculous. You're never going to get artificial intelligence to make a decision.
Never.
We can't make them. This is our job.
Okay.
We've been
trained. But you can at least, you might not make the right call, but you can at least look at a president of the United States. And I've been listening for the last 24 hours to some conservative media outlets talking about this, and they'll talk about how the examples that I keep hearing repeated. Well, the Iranians talk about wanting to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and nobody takes down their online content. Maxine Waters talks about violence toward Republicans. Nobody takes down that content, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a perception in the conservative media world that Facebook has it in for the right wing. And by the way, in your book, quote, for years, right-wing conservatives had been complaining that Facebook, run by those liberals in Silicon Valley, discriminated against them by taking down their posts. The claim, you say, was unsupported by the data. What did you learn about any bias on the part of Facebook when you were writing this enormous tome?
Right. Well, as I say, we just went over really what determines what the rules by which Facebook takes things down, and you can talk about those rules. And I argue they should look at outcomes and and see how that applies. But that's totally false. If you look at the most engaged posts on a given day in Facebook, they're overwhelmingly from the right wing. So if you look at which posts get traction and circulation, there's these right-wing blogs that have like several times the volume of New York Times stories, the most popular thing in the New York Times or Washington Post or even the Wall Street Journal for that matter. So there's no backing for that at all. What the right is arguing for is the ability to post disinformation on Facebook, because that's the stuff that's taken down, and that largely comes from the right. And I think
there's a criticism of Zuckerberg as too little, too late. Your bread was being buttered for the last 4 years by Trump. You could say the same thing about Dorsey and Twitter. I mean, the president's got an enormous Twitter following. Twitter is his methodology of choice. What thoughts does Stephen Levy have about how it's truly the 11th hour of the Trump administration, and only now are we seeing these attempts at regulation?
Yeah. But first, that's a great point about Twitter, because mostly what Trump does on Facebook is repost his tweets. So it really is Twitter which has his big power. But I think in terms of Zuckerberg, I think too little, too late could be accurate there. I think what people have noted is not only did this happen after the Capitol debacle, riot, whatever you want to call it, a dark day in our history, but it happened the day after the Senate went to the Democrats. And, so maybe with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, Zuckerberg will find less advantage in keeping Trump up. And just like the cabinet members who were like abandoning the sinking ship, Zuckerberg, wants to get the cred of saying, hey, I blocked Donald Trump, like me, Democrats.
When Zuckerberg was in his Harvard dorm room trying to figure out how to meet girls, did he ever envision that he was creating a platform that would influence opinion? And similarly, did the people at Twitter ever envision the hold that they might have on the court of public opinion?
Yeah. First, let me do Mark a favor and say he had a girlfriend back then, so he didn't start Facebook, to win over some women. But, the answer is no. They both started, Zuckerberg started this to know what classes, when you sign up for a class, are there any friends in the class, and who's dating who, and what party did you go to? It was something to make the college experience better by knowing what your friends were up to. And in Twitter's case, it was a way to use text messaging to let people know what you were up to. Hey, I'm going to the diner to have lunch. Now I'm doing this, now I'm doing that. So again, it was something to notify your friends. As these things grew, the ambitions of the people operating these systems became bigger and bigger and bigger. So Facebook decided it was going to be the universal newspaper for anything you wanted to know in the world. And Twitter wanted to be, they called itself the pulse of the planet. And that makes a more complicated task for them, because they have this responsibility with billions of people reading what they do, not to overthrow governments.
Stephen, I believe, just for the benefit of you, the radio audience knows, because I've been very, very clear in how I view the events of Wednesday. I blame the president. I believe the president incited what unfolded. And I've taken time on radio to go back through his words to showcase exactly what he said and the timing of when he said it on Wednesday, butting right up against when Vice President Pence was beginning those proceedings. I've gone over his word choice. I've gone over the word choice of Rudy, the word choice of Don Jr., et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to know my view is he lit that fuse. Having said so, I'm unsettled. I am unsettled by Facebook taking him down. I'm unsettled by Jack Dorsey. I'm unsettled on a variety of levels for the singling out of him because I believe there's a lot of hate speech out there by world leaders that doesn't get regulated. And so I'm really in a quandary, in a bit of an uncomfortable position. I feel like the best way to deal with the president is to call him out and take him on, not to completely scrub all reference and access that he has to social media. How do you see it?
Well, those are great points. But if you're in charge of a service and someone's posting something that's going to result in a riot, do you want that on your service? So let's move this away from the U.S. and to the Philippines, where the person in charge there posted things about his political opponent that got people riled up and caused a riot, which killed people. Or used it against his critics in the press and had people post things about her, which were these salacious sexual insults. You look at Myanmar, where the people in power, use it to cause riots. Do you want to have those things up and play a part in that yourself? It's a difficult question, and I really think that when you start a service like that, you're not really going to think that, gee, we're going to be in a position one day where the president of the United States is putting up content that's going to put Americans' lives at risk. That is beyond the pale. So I hope to God that this is a unique situation that will never be in again, because they made a decision 5 years ago when Trump did his first post about the Muslims that, wow, this violates our terms of service. It's kind of hate speech. What should we do with it? And they decided people should know what the president says. But if the president says something that's going to get people killed, do you want to play a part in that?
Where is it going? In your newsletter, you predict that Facebook's ban will be permanent.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is that they're going to let him back on, like Twitter let him back on. But Donald Trump, how long is it going to take before he's back at it and doing toxic tweets that are reposted on Facebook? And I think he'll be less newsworthy by definition when he's no longer president anymore. So it'll be easier for them to treat him just like some random crazy person who's saying things that violate their policy.
Is the market going to sort this out? Is there a Twitter alternative? Can Parler provide Donald Trump what he's looking for and maybe what Parler is looking for?
No, I don't think so. I mean, part of, what Trump's power was that he would do these transgressive things on Twitter. They'd be available to everyone to see. They would cause panics. And then he got to use Twitter to fire people and do other kinds of things. When he moves to, or if he moves to something that just talks to his base, so to speak, I don't think it's going to have the same power, and he won't have the power of the presidency, so it won't be as newsworthy. So I think that in terms of social media, really what he says is going to be reduced dramatically. And I think in a year from now, we're not going to be hanging on what Donald Trump tweets if he's on the platform at all.
Okay, sum up. Stephen Levy, who is an editor-at-large for Wired and author of the definitive book on Facebook, thinks that the SiriusXM audience most needs to know what about Facebook having prevented the president from further access to its platform, at least through the inauguration.
I think that, Facebook did what it had to do under pressure, knowing that in the next few years it's going to face a huge threat to its growth and sustaining what it is from regulation in Washington.
Hey, Stephen, always a privilege. I love the book. I really appreciate it. I'm thinking of going back and reading it again because I feel like I need the lessons that you offered in that book 2 years ago, probably by now, just to filter all the events that are still unfolding around us. So thank you for coming back. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and I appreciate your support. It's great to hear that I reached you in my writing.
You did, and I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it. Thank you, Stephen.